Just as the true crime genre seems to be at an all-time high, fictionalized dramatizations have also peaked in popularity. There's rarely a month that goes by without a new, wild docuseries becoming the online equivalent of water cooler conversation, and most streamers have tried to capitalize on any persisting mainstream interest by greenlighting scripted retellings. Just this year, limited series have been released that tackle infamous cases ranging from the likes of Amanda Knox to Natalia Grace, while October alone sees the release of scripted shows about serial killers Ed Gein and John Wayne Gacy. How factually accurate any of these projects are deemed to be seems a moot point, especially once the viewership numbers come in. But at least Hulu's latest foray into ripped from the headlines territory, Murdaugh, Death in the Family, is forthright about any artistic liberties being taken. The problem is that, over the course of 8 episodes, the limited series from co-creators Michael D. Fuller and Aaron Lee Carr has a lot of essential gaps to fill in, and well-written speculation can only accomplish so much from a storytelling perspective. What ultimately works against Murdaugh, Death in the Family's success is the fact that, in lieu of the truth, there's not much that any glossy, well-cast dramatization can still add to the conversation.
What is Murdaugh, Death in the Family about? In South Carolina's Low Country, the Murdaughs have made a name for themselves going back generations, accompanied by a significant amount of wealth, privilege, and notoriety. Alex Murdaugh currently works at a local law firm with his older brother, Randy, and their father, Randolph, once bolstered the family's reputation as a circuit solicitor for the state before joining them in private practice. As for things at home, Alex's wife Maggie is a well-known socialite with a tradition of hosting lavish parties on her husband's behalf, while their 2 sons, Paul and Buster, seem to be walking 2 very different paths in life. At the time the series begins, in 2019, Buster is showing every indication of wanting to follow in his dad's footsteps by going to law school, while Paul seems more content to party with his friends. Even if you don't know the full story, you can probably make an informed guess about where Paul's excessive drinking and generally irresponsible behavior will lead. When a night of partying on the open water ends in tragedy, the resulting investigation and clear interference from the Murdaughs regarding who's ultimately responsible kick off a series of events that threaten to expose even darker truths within one of the Low Country's most powerful families.
Murdaugh, Death in the Family's cast can't make up for the series' biggest flaw. At first glance, Murdaugh, Death in the Family has some aspects working in its favor, chief among them an impressive cast, and from an acting standpoint, the biggest names in this ensemble would normally be reason enough to watch. Clarke, who has long been a compelling presence on screen, is almost unrecognizable in the role of the ill-fated Murdaugh family patriarch. Although his voice can't quite match the higher register of the real figure he's depicting, he's able to successfully capture the personality of someone whose obnoxious, bulldozing boisterousness has long been mistaken for charisma. Where Clarke's performance tips the scale from intriguing to riveting is when all of Alex's illegal activities start catching up to him. The Australian-born actor has to shoulder the weight of portraying a sense of increased desperation that seemingly reaches its breaking point and does so commendably. Similar praise is worth handing to Arquette, who almost has more heavy lifting to do in portraying Maggie's internalization over the duration of her story. There are a few particularly striking moments where she doesn't have to utter a word of dialogue for us to know exactly what's going through her head based on facial expression alone. As the visibly more troubled of the 2 Murdaugh sons, Paul, Berchtold's complex performance elevates what could have become too one-note in lesser hands. But even the likes of Emmerich and McRaney as 2 of the Murdaugh legal dynasty's most prominent figures, Succession's J. Smith Cameron as Maggie's resigned sister Marion Proctor, or a woefully underutilized Mark Pellegrino as Alex's shady cousin Curtis Eddie Smith, aren't enough to overcome the limited series' most glaring issue. Murdaugh, Death in the Family does claim inspiration from Mandy Matney's Murdaugh Murders podcast, which frequently broke new information about the ongoing murder case when it first launched in 2021, and attempts to depict Matney's investigative efforts by incorporating a version of her, played by Brittany Snow, into the narrative. But despite Matney receiving executive producer credit, her small-screen portrayal feels largely siloed from the rest of the story that plays out, to the point where Snow's scenes probably could have been cut altogether without disrupting any part of the Murdaugh family misfortune. The rise of the 8-episode streaming season has ultimately resulted in a majority of new television shows ending up in one of two camps. Either a more complex story becomes too compressed, which impacts the season's overall pacing, or the sparse factual beats are too stretched out over the runtime and certain episodes have to rely more heavily on filler. It doesn't take very long at all to determine that Murdaugh, Death in the Family is definitely in the latter party. Watching this series in particular reveals a fundamental flaw with this type of true crime storytelling, especially when there's not much more that can be extrapolated or expanded beyond what's already been reported. The facts, as we know them, can only take up so many minutes, which means that the remainder has to be completed with scenes that border on melodrama at best and wild speculation at worst. Tragically, the victims of what would go on to become the biggest legal case in South Carolina history can't actually speak for themselves. But the overarching question that Murdaugh, Death in the Family leaves in its wake is whether it's more irresponsible to put words in their mouths before what would have been their last moments, regardless of any preceding disclaimer.